Every year, people around the world generate billions of tons of trash. And for most of us, we toss our garbage into a bin and it's out of sight and out of mind. But the truth is that our trash never really goes away.
I think it's hard to deny that we're either at or kind of past even the point of kind of having a crisis of waste. We try to send trash away and it, comes back in all sorts of ways in these, great garbage patches in the ocean, in microplastics that now we all have in our bodies.
That's Sarah Newman, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Social Sciences at the University of Chicago. She's the author of the book Unmaking Waste, New Histories of Old Things.
We can all kind of try to buy sustainable products and, rinse out our yogurt containers. But the scale of production and the scale of disposal are just so far beyond any individual person that I think the questions that we have to ask and the solutions that we have to come up with really have to be much bigger than saying reduce, reuse, and recycle, on an individual scale.
But it wasn't always this way. Newman is an archaeologist by training who has studied ancient cultures around the world and how they handled waste throughout history.
What we're really finding are things that are kind of being stored to be reused again, not necessarily things that have been thrown away and are supposed to stay there forever.
So what if our modern waste management systems aren't solving the problem, but are instead designed to keep us from seeing the real crisis of our disposable culture?
I want to try to sort of break down and unmake the kind of taken for granted idea of waste that I think a lot of people tend to have today. And by that I mean kind of the idea that everything that we make has some kind of inevitable endpoint, that everything will eventually become waste.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, welcome to Big Brains, the show where we explore the groundbreaking research and discoveries that are transforming our world. I'm your host, Paul Rand. Join me as we meet the minds behind the breakthroughs. On today's episode, the history of garbage and how we should solve our global problem of waste. If you appreciate hearing from the experts in research and science who are shaping our world, please consider subscribing to the Big Brains YouTube channel. It ensures that you never miss an episode, and it helps these important conversations reach a broader audience of learners. Bold and curious. These words describe the guests that you hear on Big Brains who are shaping the future of research. The University of Chicago is launching a new campaign called Chicago Minds to further advance this kind of groundbreaking work and expand the university's global impact. Learn more at chicagominds.uchicago.edu. Well, the title of your book is Unmaking Waste. And I wondered what you mean by that title and what you were trying to get us to think about.
I mean it in a conceptual way that I want to try to sort of break down and unmake the kind of taken for granted idea of waste that I think a lot of people tend to have today. And by that I mean kind of the idea that everything that we make has some kind of inevitable endpoint, that everything will eventually become waste. But I also think that I mean it in a practical way too, where if we were somehow able to actually unmake that notion and undo that expectation that things will always become waste, that we would be able to kind of radically change our relationships to the things that we produce and the things that we do with them, including wasting them.
Okay, well, part of it, of your central claim in this book is that waste is not natural or it's not universal, that it's a modern invention. And that actually really struck me as not something I was expecting.
I mean, you actually don't have to look that far back into the past to see that people have thought about these things very differently. And so some of my examples come from, these ancient Maya cities in the jungles of Guatemala from, as I said, 1,000 or more years ago. But some of the examples, come from the 19th century United States or Western Europe. And even then, people have had really different relationships to things than we do kind of right in this moment, with the kind of mass production and consumerism that we have today.
But when you say it was invented, or it's invented trash, what are you trying to communicate by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time, people have not necessarily thought that that the things that we make and use eventually become something that is totally useless or totally valueless, And again, even into sort of the 19th and early 20th centuries, most people would reuse most of the materials that were part of their daily life, I mean, you would eat something and then you would boil down the bones and you would use the grease for one thing. The bones would get burnt into charcoal and used for, a variety of things. Anything made of metal could be sold and resold and reused as scrap metal. And so part of the difference has to do with the fact that, now we have very different materials in our lives. I mean, things like plastics and all sorts of other synthetic materials that can't necessarily be reused in that way. But yeah, I think that and part of our transition to using those things, we really did kind of have to be taught to throw things away. I mean, when plastics were originally, created, part of the selling point of plastics was, well, we'll never have to throw anything away again because they last forever. I mean, they can be made into any shape. They can do anything you want. And yeah, you'll never need to replace things if they're made out of plastic. And so people kind of, had to learn to take this incredible material that, is never going to break down and can take any shape, be very colorful, all sorts of things. And that we've had to learn that we should take this kind of amazing material and throw it in the trash. And often, many times a day. I mean, every time you open a piece of packaging, you're kind of taking, years of science and technology and this, kind of amazing creation. And it's, a 1-second interaction before you throw it away.
Okay, well, part of this, which is also interesting, is that what counts as garbage in the U.S. right now may not register in garbage somewhere else in the world, say Japan. And I think maybe you can add a little light on what's the line between trash and treasure between different cultures, even in today's world.
So, I mean, composting is a really easy example that, it's difficult to compost if you live in an apartment building in a dense urban center versus if you live on a farm. So food scraps for one person are sort of have to be waste, whereas for another they can be, something that's in the stage of being transformed into really valuable soil. There's also, cultural differences in terms of the types of things that people see as being reusable, or the attachments that people have to even things that are, mass-produced products that, there's certain things that, you or I might think of as a kind of disposable commodity, and other people might see as something more valuable.
Absolutely. Well, one of the other arguments you make, which I think is interesting, is that waste isn't only the stuff that we throw out. It's also the things that we leave behind.
It's sort of a myth to think that every time we throw something away that we're doing that in a kind of way that's totally unthinking or that somehow isn't meaningful, I mean, if you think about every time you put something in a trash can, you're sort of making a decision about the kind of person you are, right? You're not the kind of person who litters. Or every time you wash out a yogurt container, you're sort of making a statement like, I am the kind of person that recycles, And so I think there's a sense of waste in which, sure, there's kind of this physical thing that we're putting into landfills or we're, burning in incinerators or something like that. But then there's also that sense in which, there's a sense of kind of being wasteful, of how you decide to leave things behind. And so, another good example is you see people who make a big effort with things that are important to them, to pass those things down, to donate them. I mean, there's ways in which we're always making decisions about how we want to leave things behind. And garbage is one of those ways, but it's just as meaningful as the other ways, I think.
Okay. Well, the other point you make is that there's really never been a quote unquote a way for things to go, and most of us discard without a whole lot of thought of where it goes after that discarding.
Yeah, I mean, that, I think we've kind of always been chasing this dream of not just making waste go away, but somehow turning the act of making waste into something productive, right? That we've always kind of tried to come up with solutions to the problem of waste that somehow are going to make it so that actually it's not a problem to create the waste in the first place. So now, I mean, today we're putting a lot of energy into, or I should say a lot of efforts into waste to energy plants. And even those are kind of adaptations of earlier attempts to burn trash, or even, in the 20th century, there were these attempts to create what were called reduction plants, which were basically to kind of squeeze out organic garbage and use the extracts to kind of as fertilizers, and even in some instances as the basis for perfumes, which is kind of ironic. But I think we're sort of always imagining that the relationships that we have with the things that we make can also end on our own terms, and I think increasingly we're seeing that that's not the case, that we try to send trash away and it, comes back in all sorts of ways, in these, great garbage patches in the ocean, in microplastics that now we all have in our bodies. I mean, we're thinking that we're sending things away and they're kind of coming back in unexpected ways.
You spent a lot of your time in Guatemala and studying the Mayan culture, but I wonder if you can set the stage and give us an understanding of the Mayan people and how they were thought of at their time and how we look at them historically today, to help put this waste question for them into some context.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing is that, we use the term Maya to cover kind of a really broad area, a really broad swath of time and a lot of people. But the people that I am focused on for the most part in the book are people who are living kind of in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize. And like I said, there are cities that have been growing and expanding in that region since, the beginning of the first millennium. So one thing that I look at in the book is there are some glyphs where when the Maya are writing about Earth, or showing kind of depictions of very fertile soil, they tend to show it with these symbols that they also use sometimes for like really pungent odors, like, forest animals like peccaries and deer and stuff like that. And so what I think is happening there is that people are kind of indicating that the really fertile soils are those that have night soil or excrement incorporated into them. And so that's one of the things that I kind of look at in the book, is this the different ways that people take different forms of waste, everything from human excrement to broken up pieces of ceramics and other organic forms of refuse, and that they seem to be in a lot of cases using that and incorporating that refuse back into soils for a bunch of different purposes. So sometimes it's for agricultural fields. You find that people are taking excrement and ash and broken pottery out of their houses and tilling it into their fields, which improves the quality of the soil, the drainage of the soil. And then in other cases, they're also collecting that kind of stuff in a sort of dump near their house, and then from time to time digging back out that dump where you would have that kind of soil that's different from the soil around it, and using that in architectural constructions and things like that. So there's sort of I understand that as a kind of sense in which these things that we would call waste, they're always kind of being transformed into something else. So, you know, as they're breaking down, say you have a ceramic pot that you use to hold water, and then the pot breaks. There's other uses for the little pieces of that pot. You know, people use them to, as a little scoop, to feed animals, to protect saplings as they're growing. There's all sorts of examples of people doing this. And then when those pieces break down and you can't use them in that way anymore, they'll put them up on top of their houses to protect the perishable thatch roofs that they use. And then eventually when they get worn down, as they get rained on and things, they're getting mixed into soils for architectural fill or for agriculture. And so I think it's slightly different from the sense of recycling, right? Because when we're recycling, we're always thinking, well, we made this thing, it doesn't work this way anymore, but we'll reuse it in different ways. And here, there's sort of an understanding that these things, they just kind of go in cycles.
They have a life cycle.
And eventually,
right.
Yeah, and eventually you'll dig out that soil and make a new pot with it. So it's kind of a continuous cycle of transformation rather than,
So one of the words that I did learn by reading was this concept of middens. And it's, in other words, this is kind of a trash heap that archaeologists dig through.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, middens are kind of basically any place that people have kind of concentrated, leaving things behind.
Okay.
And archaeologists love to find middens because they're usually these dense concentrations of artifacts. And so,
Got it.
you know, you can kind of dig a small area, and usually you can find a ton of different types of information. And they're often, because they're kind of, you know, they're often pits that are dug out, or sometimes this happens in wells and things like that. Because they're kind of, you know, a circumscribed area, and people use them over time until they fill up the well or they fill up the pit, you can get a really good sense of how the things that people are using change over time, right? You have kind of the oldest things at the bottom and the newer things at the top. And so, yeah, archaeologists, I mean, it's sort of not exactly a standard practice, but not uncommon, say, if you're in almost any part of the world, you know, if you're working in what was a kind of domestic or residential setting, to sort of try to figure out where people were depositing the stuff that was no longer in use. I think the thing that's really interesting about this idea of middens is that, you know, all of these examples were then, at least in the Maya area, where people are returning to those middens and excavating them to reuse the soil. To me, that kind of suggests that, sure, archaeologists are finding middens all over the place, but what we're really finding are things that are kind of being stored to be reused again.
Got it.
Not necessarily things that have been thrown away and are supposed to stay there forever.
At some point, they just stayed, though.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, you know, people abandon their houses. There's
Right.
all sorts of things that happen, you know. And so, I mean, it's kind of like, I like to think of them a little bit like, you know, in classical archaeology, there are all sorts of examples of people finding hoards, you know, where Roman soldiers will be carrying coins, and then something happens and they think they're going to come back and get their little pot of silver, and then they never come back. And I think there's something similar happening with the Middens in the Maya area, that people are, you know, kind of disposing of things, but in a way that's always potentially useful for something, and sometimes they never get around to using it.
Tell me about Alsace and why it didn't fit the categories that you as archaeologists normally rely on.
Yeah, so Alsace is kind of a, you know, it's not one of the biggest Maya centers from the time period, but especially kind of early on, like around 300 to 400 AD. My very first year of graduate school, I was digging with my advisor in Alsace, and one of the things that we found there was a very early royal tomb. So, you know, there were broken and burnt pieces of pottery. There were some broken animal bones. But there were also, you know, there were some human bones in there. There were pieces of jade. There were also, you know, really kind of beautiful tools and different types of ornaments made out of animal bone. And so initially it was kind of hard to understand what I was looking at with this kind of mix of things that some looked like trash and some looked to me valuable, right? And actually, it's not that uncommon to find that kind of deposit in the Maya area, and even kind of more broadly in some of the related cultures in North and Central America. And so the Guatemalan excavators that I was working with, the archaeologists said, oh, this is a termination ritual. And I had not really heard that term before. And I was kind of struck both by the idea that there's a specific category for this kind of mix of things, and also that the category is kind of described as the thing that you would do to make it. That you would say, what we're looking at is a ritual. When, initially I kind of thought, well, the ritual would be the thing that happens before, and what we're looking at are kind of the remains of the ritual. I found the category just kind of interesting. And then when I was, looking into the use of this term, it's actually kind of it has an interesting history in Maya archaeology. And I think for people who don't work at Maya sites, they find this, the fact that we use this category, which has a bunch of different names. Sometimes they're called termination rituals. Sometimes they're called termination deposits. Sometimes they're just called problematical deposits. Which I think says a lot. So I think to other archaeologists, this is kind of unusual to have a category that you would find in the ground and say, a problematical I found a problematical deposit. And that's kind of like you're interpreting what you found.
And what does that reveal about the Maya to come across problematical deposits?
So I think that's kind of what prompted the questions that I wanted to ask, was that, why do we have these deposits that don't fit into kind of the categories that make sense to us? It's been, probably 70 years longer, almost 100 years since people started using these categories like termination deposit, problematical deposit. But what I try to say in the book is that part of the problem is that we don't have a category between kind of ritual and trash where you could have these two things mixed together. Whereas for the Maya, like I said, there's kind of this understanding that, you can take the broken bits and pieces of things that you've been using, bury them for a while, re-excavate them, and use them to create something new, whether that's a new cycle of crops or a new building. And so I think that what's happening in that example in the palace is, that was part of kind of a renovation of that palace, and that people are kind of doing the same thing that they would do in an agricultural field, to take all those things that are, really kind of make soil fertile and are the things left behind from previous cycles of life, and to take those and kind of reseed the palace for the next cycle of life that's going to happen there, which is a very different way of thinking about the Middens than the archaeologists think about the Middens.
Well, let's transition with that setup going into our modern world and waste. It feels as if we are producing so much of it that it is overwhelming our oceans, our landfills, and other things. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think it's hard to deny that we're either at or kind of past even the point of kind of having a crisis of waste, as you say, it's like we have these enormous collections of plastic that are floating in the oceans, the size of some countries. One of the things that has also happened over time, I think this is where kind of taking a long-term view is helpful, is that at this point, a lot of waste making to a certain extent is kind of beyond the scope of individual people. I think, we can all kind of try to buy sustainable products and, rinse out our yogurt containers. But the scale of production and the scale of disposal are just so far beyond kind of any individual person that I think the questions that we have to ask and the solutions that we have to come up with really have to be much bigger than saying, reduce, reuse, and recycle, on an individual scale. And I think that that's absolutely possible. Maybe to instead of focusing on what to do with the garbage once we've produced it, to think about what kinds of things could we produce so that there would never be this problem of what to do with the waste. And of course, I mean, people have been arguing this for some time. There's a push to move towards a circular economy and things like that. And I think that that's the direction that we need to be moving in. It's just even the idea of a circular economy kind of imagines that what you want to do is produce a product that it has kind of this one use life, and then when it becomes waste, it's not a problem. What would that look like?
And this is kind of how you wrap up the book, isn't it? I mean, you talk about disposing of the very notion of waste, and becoming almost a zero waste society. Is that for lack of a better word, a dream that you think is actually achievable?
I think that the possibilities are there. I think a lot of times the problems have to do with, the fact that consumers don't always like the texture or the color of products that are actually kind of disposable or compostable as compared to the ones that are not. That, of course, it can be more expensive for producers to produce things that are environmentally friendly versus things that are not. So it's I mean, this is part of the problem, is that it really would take, I think, really ambitious kind of collective agreement from what we're doing in our everyday lives in our homes to legislation, that can be difficult to achieve. But I think the problem is a social problem, not necessarily a technological or kind of environmental problem.
Well, one of the descriptions you had in the book was talking about yourself as a past-loving creature living on a ruined planet. Gosh, that's a heavy thought. Tell me what you mean by that.
I mean, a ruined planet, it's true. It is kind of a dark picture, but I don't know how else to describe things like the Pacific garbage patch, the size of sanitary landfills. I mean, it's difficult to paint some of those things in a positive light, I mean, that this is kind of the mark we're leaving on the planet, it's the things we're leaving behind. And so
well, speaking of that, say we come back and society comes back and another Sarah Newman 100, 200, 300 years in the future comes back. What are they going to think about the civilization that we're in right now, and maybe even in relation to recycling and waste and so forth?
One of the things that I think about sometimes is, imagine if you had an archaeologist just looking at Airbnbs around the world. It's like every culture would be the same, it would be kind of a certain mid-century modern aesthetic. And so I think that's one of the things that I find kind of interesting and maybe surprising to think about, is that in a certain way it would be difficult to read kind of the differences among people in the archaeological record, given how much of our...
Because we've gotten more similar in how we're living and what we're discarding.
There's a certain kind of converging of things. I mean, the one thing that would be really interesting is, I think about this a lot, kind of that I imagine there must be now in landfills a kind of strata of the COVID pandemic, that there's
of course, masks and
face masks and tests and gloves and thermometers. All sorts
excellent
of
point.
So that's one that I think about too. That's a really, and that of course there'll be all sorts of traces of that historical moment. But say there were something to happen where there was only the archaeological traces and no kind of text or memory about this. I think you could still get a pretty good idea of what happened there.
One question that I want to make sure we touch on is this concept of recycling.
Yeah, I mean, so in the same class, where the talking trash class, where I wanted people to not make any waste, there was also a woman who was a choreographer who had worked with the sanitation department in Austin, Texas, to choreograph a dance that she called trash dance. Yeah, in the landfill. And it was amazing. It was, people kind of dancing with their bulldozers. It was amazing. And she came to speak to the class, and one of the students asked her, what did you learn kind of spending a year following along with the sanitation workers, And she said, well, I'll tell you one thing, I stopped recycling.
Okay.
Was not exactly what I hoped she would say to these, kind of hopeful first-year students. But what she explained to the class was just that when you actually go to see a landfill, you kind of realize that, again, kind of like that individual people are not really the major problem there, that it's, construction debris makes up a huge amount of landfills. But there's also, I think, in the same way that we don't necessarily know where our waste is going after we kind of take it out of the house and bring it to the curb, we also don't really understand in general how recycling works. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that you see this is what people call aspirational recycling.
Yes,
and people do this all the time. I mean, I find myself doing this, where we all have that complicated chart to say these are the kinds of plastics you can recycle, and then you have an object that has many different types of plastics, maybe some metal, maybe some wood, and you think, I hope it's recyclable. I'll put it in the recycling and someone will figure this out, And really what that does most of the time is to kind of ruin the entire batch of plastics that's supposed to be recycled. And so there's a certain way in which recycling is, I think, one of these things that people really like to feel like that's a viable solution, right? That if we can just recycle things, then, I mean, if you're the kind of person who's recycling, you're a good person, you're not really contributing to the waste problem as much as maybe other people. But one of the examples that I give in the book is that, a lot of the way that recycling works in the US and Canada and some other countries is that for a long time, most of that was just shipped to China and some other countries that would process especially plastics, paper, that kind of thing. And in 2018, China put in some new regulations, and they decided they didn't want to be kind of the world's garbage dump. And so they increased basically the levels of purity in terms of the plastic. So all that aspirational recycling really becomes a problem, because then you ruin, like I said, entire batches of plastic that might be recycled. And when that was happening in a lot of cities in the US, what happened was that, recycling companies could no longer export the recycling. And so they were just picking up recycling bins and taking those materials to
performative
dump.
Recycling.
Exactly. And so, the idea was, well, one, we want people to still be able to feel good about recycling. And two, when we figure out where the recycling can go, we don't want to break the pattern. We want people to continue this practice of recycling. And so in some ways, I just think that's such a good example of kind of, these myths around both waste and the kind of solutions to it, that we kind of tell ourselves the problem isn't that bad, or that we have these solutions without really understanding either the problem or the solution. And that's,
You said that you kind of hope that archaeology will stop taking garbage for granted. And how do you think about that, even as you think about society as a whole?
So I think that one of the things that comes out of this kind of idea of archaeology as the science of rubbish, or the fact that a lot of archaeologists, without necessarily doing this consciously, tend to kind of assume that we can recognize middens when we see them, that we kind of know what trash looks like no matter who's producing it. I think one of the things that does, and again, this is kind of inadvertent, but it does kind of make it so that that trash becomes something that seems kind of natural and inevitable, right? That we can say, well, people have always been producing trash, whether they were flaking little bits of stone off of rocks to produce stone tools, or producing, grinding up pottery shards to put back into other types of ceramics. But again, that's not really the same as what we're doing today, And I think in some ways it kind of, creates this narrative that really we've just kind of been on this track of continual progress of both making new kinds of waste, but also having new and better ways to deal with it. And so I think that one of the things that, like I was saying, archaeology actually has the possibility to do is to show that that hasn't always been the case, and to show that there are other ways of, being a human in the world that don't require you to produce something that we consider valueless, that needs to be thrown away. And so that's what I mean about kind of undoing this idea that garbage is an inevitable fact of human life, that archaeologists are really the ones who should be showing that that's not necessarily the case, rather than saying, let's look at the garbage people have.